I remember that grim afternoon in Charleston like it happened yesterday. We had just laid my grandfather to rest, the only man who had ever truly believed in me, when my mother stood up in front of the entire room, placed a deliberate hand on her new husband's arm, and calmly declared, "From this moment on, Richard will be running the Beaumont Corporation." The air shifted instantly. No one questioned her. Aunts, uncles, even a few board members remained still and silent, as if this announcement had been rehearsed behind closed doors long before the casket was even lowered into the ground. And maybe it had. I didn't freeze out of shock, I froze because of the audacity. Richard, my stepfather of less than a year, the same man who'd spent the last 6 months mocking my capability with smug little comments about how kids these days can't handle real responsibility, was now being handed the empire my grandfather built from nothing. I scanned the room. No one spoke. No one defended me. In their eyes, I was just the girl too young, too emotional, too untested. But they had no idea what was coming. Because there was one thing my mother didn't know. My grandfather left everything to me, and I was holding the ace they never saw coming. Just a week before the funeral, I sat by my grandfather's hospital bed in Savannah General, a place that reeked of bleach, loss, and slow goodbyes. The sun filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin golden lines across his fragile hands, which had once gripped the reins of an empire, but now trembled as they held mine. His skin, once weathered but firm, had turned paper-thin, and his voice, once booming across boardrooms and family dinners, had softened into a whisper that barely reached me over the hum of the machines. "Mara," he rasped, his breath shallow and labored, "you're the only one I trust." Those words, simple as they were, splintered something inside me. All my life, he had been the one steady hand in a house full of silence and disapproval, the only one who had seen past my missteps, my inexperience, and my youth to the fire I tried so hard to hide. And now, as the end circled him like vultures overhead, he was choosing to spend his final ounces of strength on me. I tried to hold back the tears, but the moment he tightened his grip on my fingers, barely perceptible, yet determined, they fell anyway. My mother had always made it clear that I was a disappointment, an inconvenience born of obligation rather than affection. She rarely missed an opportunity to remind me of my shortcomings, often in front of guests or board members, and as I grew older, she made it known I was never going to be cut out for the real world. But my grandfather, he never spoke to me like that. He let me shadow him in meetings, encouraged me to ask questions, handed me reports to read when I was barely 16, and took genuine interest in my ideas, even when they were naive. He didn't coddle me, he challenged me, but he never dismissed me. And in that final moment, when he could have spoken to anyone about anything, he chose to give me a warning. "Don't let them take what I built," he whispered, each word costing him. "They'll try, and when they do, don't be afraid. I've prepared everything." I didn't know what he meant then, not fully, and I was too overwhelmed to ask. All I could do was nod through the tears, trying to memorize every wrinkle on his face, every flicker of determination left in his eyes, because deep down, I knew this would be the last conversation we'd ever have. And it was. The next morning, he was gone. The grief came in waves, sharp, suffocating, unpredictable, but it was quickly overtaken by something colder: betrayal. I should have had time to mourn, to sit with the loss, to remember him not as a tycoon or a legend, but as the man who taught me how to tie my shoes, how to read a balance sheet, and how to fight fair. Instead, I found myself thrust into a game where the rules had been rewritten behind my back, and everyone I thought might stand beside me had already chosen sides. My mother moved fast, too fast. Within days of his passing, she began repositioning Richard like a chess piece, introducing him to board members, speaking of stability and legacy as if they had been her guiding values all along. She said things like, "We must honor Dad's wishes," while quietly rearranging the furniture in Grandpa's study and calling contractors to remodel his office. I stood by, silent but watching, And though my heart was shattered, a different kind of resolve began to take root. Because if Grandpa's final words meant anything, and I knew they did, then he had left something behind, a plan, a safeguard, something more powerful than any staged speech or insider whisper. The moment the lawyer opened the will, I would find out just how much he had trusted me and just how far my mother was willing to go to take it all away. When the lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat to read the will, I felt the oxygen shift in the room. My mother, seated upright and composed in a tailored navy dress far too celebratory for a funeral, stared at him with the quiet expectation of someone who believed the outcome had already been sealed. She wasn't waiting to hear if she would inherit the company. She was waiting for confirmation that Richard's name would officially be stamped onto the legacy my grandfather built from nothing. But instead of hearing Richard's name, the lawyer looked directly at me and, in a tone that was both deliberate and irrevocable, announced that my grandfather James T. Beaumont had left the entire estate, including all shares in Beaumont Holdings, solely to me. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't the shocked kind of silence that comes when a tragedy strikes, nor was it the respectful kind you hear in church pews. It was hollow. Charged, almost violent. I could feel every pair of eyes swing toward me with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled resentment, as if they had just witnessed something unnatural, something that broke an unspoken order of family succession. "That must be a mistake," my mother said sharply, her voice clipped at the edges like a blade. "He meant to leave it to me." The lawyer didn't even flinch. "I can assure you, Mrs. Carlyle, there is no mistake. Mara is the sole heir. Effective immediately, she owns the company, the estate, and all financial holdings tied to Mr. Beaumont's name." I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt the walls closing in. Because the moment those words left his mouth, the temperature in the room dropped, and I saw something shift in my mother's eyes, something venomous and calculated. The shock lasted less than 5 seconds before it was replaced by rage, so tightly masked it could have passed for composure to anyone who didn't know her as I did. "If that's how it is," she said in a tone laced with cold fury, "then you can leave this house immediately." At first, I didn't even understand what she meant. "This house?" I repeated, stunned. "You mean Grandpa's house?" She narrowed her eyes. "It was our home, and you're no longer welcome here." I couldn't help the soft laugh that escaped Minot out of amusement, but out of sheer disbelief. "You might want to read that will a little more carefully, Mother," I said, my voice steady even as my heart pounded. "Because something tells me this house isn't yours anymore either." She went white, not pale white, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, and I saw her fighting the urge to scream. Beside her, Richard's mask began to crack. His eyes darted between me and the lawyer like a man watching a poker game he just realized he's losing and badly. "You're joking," my mother whispered, her voice lower now, tighter. "Your grandfather would never do this to me. Never." The lawyer, unshaken, calmly flipped a few pages in his folder. "Mr. Beaumont made his wishes quite clear, and I've confirmed with the estate's legal team. There is nothing to dispute. Mara Beaumont is the sole beneficiary. Her authority is already in effect." Her response wasn't to scream, it was worse. She turned to me, her voice smooth and cold, like polished marble. "If that's true, then get your things and leave. You're no longer welcome in my home." There was something darkly poetic in the way she said that, like she was grasping for control in the only place left where she could claim authority, and even that was slipping through her fingers. I exhaled slowly, choosing my next words carefully. "You're confused, Mother. This isn't your home anymore. It's mine." Her mouth twitched slightly, as though her brain refused to process what she was hearing. Richard stepped in then, wearing that smug little smile I had come to know all too well, the one he used when he thought he was about to outsmart someone half his age. "Mara, sweetheart," he began, his voice thick with condescension. "You're young. This is a complex business, a company of this size. It's not something you can treat like a school project. You don't understand what it takes." And there it was, the subtle erosion of confidence cloaked in the language of concern, but I had heard it too many times to be fooled. What he really meant was, "You're too naive. You're too soft. You're too easy to control." I folded my arms and met his gaze head on. "Let me get this straight," I said. "The moment you realized you weren't getting the company, my mother tried to kick me out of my own home. And now you're suggesting I should just hand it all over to you for the sake of experience?" Richard's fake smile didn't falter, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. "That's not what I'm saying at all." "No?" I leaned forward slightly. "Because it sounds a lot like you and my mother were already planning how you'd divide up the company the second Grandpa was gone." My mother slammed her palm down on the table so hard the glasses rattled. "You don't know what you're doing, Mara," she snapped. "This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You think this is some kind of personal victory? It's a death sentence. You're going to ruin everything he built." But before I could respond, the lawyer stepped in again, his voice calm and clipped. "Actually, Mr. Beaumont anticipated this. He appointed a team of executive advisors to support Mara's transition into her role as CEO. The board has already been informed. Legal documentation has been finalized." The silence that followed was nearly unbearable. Richard looked like someone had punched him in the gut and smiled while doing it. My mother's expression crumbled, falling apart in slow motion as she realized there was no escape clause, no loophole, no technicality she could exploit. My grandfather hadn't just passed me the torch, he had built a fortress around it, knowing full well they'd try to snatch it from my hands the second his casket was closed. They weren't ready to lose, but I was ready to fight. The night after the will was read, I barely slept. I wasn't afraid in the traditional sense. There was no panic, no crying, but a quiet weight settled on my chest, like the kind you feel standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the ground behind you is gone and the only way forward is straight through the storm. I had just inherited an empire, yes, but I had also inherited a battlefield. And I knew the first attack hadn't been the outburst at the reading, it was just the opening move. By morning, I had already received a dozen calls from board members, lawyers, and the estate's financial team. Most were professional, even polite, but their tone carried the same underlying question. "Are you sure you can handle this?" I dressed in black slacks, a navy blouse, and tied my hair back tight, not because I thought it would impress anyone, but because I needed to feel anchored, armored, unshakable. When I arrived at Beaumont Holdings' downtown headquarters for the first official transition meeting, I didn't expect a warm welcome, but I also didn't expect them to be standing there waiting for me. My mother and Richard were just outside the glass doors, as if they'd been rehearsing their positions, wearing carefully curated expressions of calm concern. "We need to talk," my mother said softly, almost too softly, as if the previous night's fury had been replaced by wisdom and grace. Just the three of us. No lawyers. No board members. Just family. That word family used to mean something, but coming from her lips now, it sounded like bait. Still, I nodded. Not because I wanted to hear what they had to say, but because a part of me needed to know how far they were willing to go. They led me to a quiet conference room on the 6th floor, one my grandfather had once used for mentoring young executives Saronic, really, given what was about to happen there. Richard sat down like he belonged at the head of the table, his legs crossed, hands clasped, exuding the casual arrogance of someone who believed charm could still win the war. "You're in over your head, Mara," my mother began, her voice gentle in a way that might have fooled a stranger. "Your grandfather put an impossible burden on you. This isn't fair to you. It's too much, too soon." I folded my hands in my lap, letting her speak. She was laying the foundation, the role of the protective mother, the concerned elder, the voice of reason. But I'd heard it all before. "Richard has experience," she continued, gesturing toward him like she was presenting a solution, not a co-conspirator. "He's led teams, managed assets, he knows this world. You could learn from him." I turned to look at Richard, who met my gaze with a calculated smile. "We're not here to fight," he said smoothly. "We're proposing a partnership." "A partnership?" I echoed, though my voice remained neutral. "You'll still be the face of Beaumont Holdings," he said, as if he were offering me a gift. "You'll keep the title, attend the galas, maybe a few board meetings. But I'll handle the day-to-day operations, the pressure, the decision-making. You'll never have to worry about making a costly mistake." "And what would I be then?" I asked, tilting my head. "A mascot? A figurehead in heels?" "It's a strategic arrangement," my mother interjected quickly. "The board will feel more secure. Investors will stay calm. You'll still benefit, of course. We'll make sure a generous percentage of revenue is deposited into your account each month. You'll live well, travel, do whatever makes you happy." They were offering me comfort in exchange for control. They were dressing up their manipulation in the language of care, spinning exile into opportunity, and they genuinely thought I would say yes. That I would roll over, take the money, and let them build their empire on the ashes of my grandfather's. I leaned back slowly, pretending to consider it, letting the silence stretch just long enough for their hope to rise and then fall. "And what happens if I say no?" Richard's smile tightened, though he tried to hide it. My mother's eyes narrowed just slightly, enough for me to notice the storm beginning to stir. "Then you'll face this alone," she said, her tone still soft but no longer warm. "The board doesn't trust you. The shareholders are already uneasy. If you choose to isolate yourself, we won't be able to shield you from what comes next." "You mean you'll sabotage me?" I said calmly. Richard looked away, pretending to be offended. "We're trying to help you avoid a fall." "No," I replied, rising to my feet. "You're trying to take what isn't yours by pretending it's too heavy for me to carry." My mother stood as well, her mask slipping just enough for the contempt to show. "You really think you can handle this? You think the board will respect you? That the press won't chew you up the moment you make one wrong move?" "I think Grandpa believed I could," I answered, steady. "And, unlike you, I trust his judgment." She reached out suddenly, her hand gripping my wrist not forcefully, but firmly, like she could still stop this if she just said the right thing. "You don't understand how this world works, Mara. He didn't hand you a gift. He painted a target on your back." I stared at her, letting the weight of her words hang between us. "I needed you to believe in me when I was 12 and scared, when I was 15 and trying to prove myself, when I was 20 and watching you laugh at every effort I made. But you never did. So don't act like you're protecting me now." Richard stood too, clearly running out of patience. "You're making a huge mistake," he said through clenched teeth. "When this all blows up, don't come running to us." I turned toward the door without answering, but before leaving, I looked back one last time. "I won't need to." And I walked out, knowing this wouldn't be the end, but it would be the moment they realized I wasn't the pawn in their game. 2 days after I walked away from that so-called family meeting, I arrived at Beaumont Holdings for what was supposed to be my first official board meeting as CEO. I had prepared, thoroughly studied the quarterly reports, reviewed key initiatives, even rehearsed answers for anticipated questions about my qualifications, but nothing could have prepared me for the coordinated assault waiting behind those polished mahogany doors. The moment I stepped into the boardroom, I felt the energy shift subtle but sharp, like walking into a room moments after your name has been whispered. The board members, mostly men in their 60s and 70s, who had once toasted my grandfather with vintage bourbon and called him a visionary, now looked at me with wary calculation, their expressions tight, their nods brief. The seats around the table, usually filled with quiet murmurs and cordial greetings, were cold and expectant, as if something had already been decided in my absence. Before I could even finish greeting them, Robert Holloway-Yone, of the senior board members with ties to my grandfather stretching back 4 decades, leaned forward, clasping his hands in front of him with a heaviness that suggested this wasn't going to be a warm welcome. "Mara," he began, his voice carefully measured, "before we proceed, we feel there's something that needs to be addressed." I sat down slowly, placing both hands on the table. And what's that? He glanced around the room as if seeking unspoken approval, then locked eyes with me. Your grandfather was deeply respected by all of us, but some of us believe objectively that appointing you as CEO may have been premature. The words landed like a slap across the face, not because I hadn't expected resistance, but because the tone had shifted from doubt to open judgment. I kept my expression neutral, but my heart beat faster, sensing there was more behind this than concern. We've already been contacted by media outlets. Another board member, Langston added, not bothering to hide the fatigue in his voice. The press is running with the story, and the headlines aren't kind. I blinked, confused, then slipped my phone from my blazer pocket and searched. The results came fast, and each headline hit like a gut punch. Legacy in jeopardy, 25-year-old heiress takes control of Beaumont Holdings. Can the Beaumont empire survive a novice CEO? Boardroom gamble. Insiders express concern over young leadership. My stomach dropped. The headlines weren't just critical, they were laced with narrative framing, almost as if someone had fed them sound bites. The timing was too perfect, too strategic, and it didn't take long for the suspicion to take root. This wasn't organic media coverage, this was sabotage. When the meeting ended, I returned to my office and locked the door behind me. There were already 3 missed calls from the company's public relations team. I sat down, hit play on the voicemails, and listened to the escalating panic. Mara, we have a situation media spiraling fast. We suspect someone inside the company leaked internal concerns. Stocks are dipping down 3% this morning. Investors are getting nervous. There's talk of proposing a leadership reassessment. There it was. The smoke before the fire. A quiet coup forming beneath the surface, fueled by whispers and articles, orchestrated by the very people who had smiled to my face just days ago. And I knew without a shadow of doubt who was behind it. Richard and my mother hadn't simply accepted their defeat. They had retreated, recalibrated, and returned with something more dangerous than anger, a strategy. If they couldn't take the company through legal means, they would dismantle my reputation piece by piece until I had no choice but to surrender it willingly. But what they didn't count on was that I had also been preparing for this exact moment. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew would understand what was happening and how to fight it. It rang twice before a smooth, familiar voice answered on the other end. "I was wondering when you'd call," said Lucas Thorne, my grandfather's most trusted advisor, a financial strategist with a reputation for turning underdog companies into dominant forces, and a man who had always seen through the polished charm of people like Richard Carlyle. "I need your help," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I assume this is about the media circus," he replied with faint amusement. "And the board," I added. "They're circling, a vote is coming." There was a pause, followed by a low hum. Classic pressure tactic. Corporate chess at its most predictable, he said. "Well then, Mara, it's time we remind them why your grandfather chose you." That night, I met Lucas in his private office, a minimalist space of glass and steel perched high above the city skyline. The view alone felt like a challenge. Either rise or disappear beneath it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if testing my resolve and finding it intact. "You're not afraid," he said. "Good, that'll make them nervous." For the next 3 hours, we strategized. Not for war, but for justice, for clarity. We didn't need to attack, only to expose. We laid out 3 clear steps. First, Lucas would activate his network of trusted investors who still respected my grandfather's legacy. With the right timing, they would issue public endorsements of my leadership, shifting investor confidence back in my direction. Second, I would give an exclusive interview, not a press release, not a corporate memo, but a face-to-face conversation that humanized the story, clarified the truth, and shared, in my own words, why my grandfather had chosen me, not as a whim, but as a plan. Third, And most importantly, Lucas would quietly trace the source of the media leaks. If Richard or my mother had fed information to journalists, there would be digital fingerprints. And when we found them, we'd make those fingerprints public. By the time we finished, the skyline had gone dark and the office lights had dimmed, but I felt more awake than I had in days. "Thank you," I said, shaking his hand. "Don't thank me yet," he replied with a grin. "Wait until you see their faces when they realize you're not the girl they thought they could break." The next morning, the narrative began to shift. Mara Beaumont speaks out. Exclusive interview airing tonight. Investor confidence rebounds as legacy investors rally behind new CEO. Internal sabotage? Leaks point to deliberate smear campaign. I sat in my office, watching the tide turn not in a wave, but inch by inch, headline by headline. The storm wasn't over. I knew Richard and my mother had more in store. But I also knew one thing. I wasn't standing alone anymore, and this time I was ready for their next move. The morning of the board vote arrived with an eerie stillness, as if the city itself had paused to watch what would happen inside the towering glass building that now bore my name. I stood on the sidewalk outside Beaumont Holdings, staring up at its steel and glass facade, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this one, every whisper, every headline, every betrayal masked as advice. I knew that whatever happened in that boardroom today would define not only my place in the company, but the legacy of the man who had entrusted me with it. I walked in with my shoulders squared and my mind steady, passing the front desk where the receptionist who once greeted me with polite indifference now offered a silent, almost respectful nod. My heels echoed through the marble hallway like a war drum, steady and sure. I wasn't here to beg or plead. I was here to finish what my grandfather had started. The boardroom was already full when I entered. Every seat was taken, and the air was thick with anticipation. These were men and women who had served under my grandfather for decades, who had seen companies rise and fall, and who now had the power to either confirm my position or end it before it ever truly began. At the head of the table sat Robert Holloway, eyes unreadable, fingers laced together atop a stack of official documents. "We'll begin with the vote," he said, his voice as formal as a courtroom judge. "Concerns have been raised regarding Ms. Beaumont's ability to lead the company. An alternative leadership proposal has been submitted. We'll hear that proposal now." The doors opened behind me, and in walked Richard and my mother, dressed for victory, moving with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. They didn't look at me as they passed. They didn't need to. In their minds, I was already out of the picture. Richard took the floor as if it were his by right, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to accept that. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and composed. "We all admire Mara. She's young, passionate, and full of promise. But this is not the time for passion. This is a time for stability, for leadership built on experience." He paced slowly, like a seasoned politician, glancing at key members of the board as he spoke. "I've worked closely with many of you over the past year. I understand this company's infrastructure. I know its clients, its risks, its obligations. For the good of Beaumont Holdings, I propose a transition. I step in as acting CEO, with Mara retaining her public-facing title. She will still be involved, but protected from mistakes, from scrutiny, from failure." He finished with a rehearsed smile, confident, relaxed, convinced that what he'd offered was reasonable enough to be accepted without resistance. For a moment, the room fell quiet. I could see a few heads nodding slowly, not out of conviction, but hesitation. And then I stood. "It's interesting, Richard," I said, my voice calm but clear, "that you claim to have the company's best interests at heart, yet you've spent the last 2 weeks trying to destroy its foundation." He turned to me, his smile faltering just slightly. "I'm sorry?" I looked toward Lucas, who had been sitting quietly beside me until that moment. He slid a slim black folder across the table toward the board members, who began to open it, their brows furrowing as they flipped through the contents. In the past week, I continued, Richard has not only leaked misleading stories to the press, but he's also initiated back-channel communications with two of our direct competitors proposing partnerships that would weaken our market position in exchange for personal gain. There was a ripple of murmurs across the room as the board read through printed emails, text transcripts, and phone logs. Mr. Holloway looked up, stunned. Where did this information come from? Lucas spoke up then, calm and precise. Our team traced the leak sources and found verifiable digital footprints leading back to a private server registered under Richard Carlisle's name. The data was forwarded to several media contacts under pseudonyms, which have now been linked to his devices. Additionally, we have documentation of attempted negotiations with Vanguard Global and Strata Corboth, of whom were offered confidential Beaumont strategies in exchange for executive consideration. Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. This is outrageous, he barked. You can't prove. We already have, I interrupted, my voice firmer now. You weren't trying to save this company, Richard. You were trying to bleed it until it was desperate enough to hand you the crown. My mother stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. Mara, enough, she snapped. You're just trying to humiliate us. I don't have to, I said, meeting her gaze. You did that yourselves. Mr. Holloway slammed his hand on the table, drawing silence. He looked at Richard with disgust. You are plotting against this company while pretending to protect it. That alone disqualifies you from any position of leadership. For the first time, Richard looked rattled, not angry, not smug-rattled. The room was turning, and he knew it. We'll proceed to the vote, Holloway announced. One by one, the board members raised their hands, not a single one in favor of Richard's proposal. The final count was unanimous. I had been confirmed as the rightful CEO of Beaumont Holdings. As the room processed the decision, I allowed myself a long, grounding breath, not of relief, but of vindication. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Security entered quietly and escorted Richard from the room. My mother followed behind him, her spine rigid, her eyes burning with fury she could no longer hide. As she passed me, she leaned in and whispered, You'll regret this. I turned to her, unshaken. The only thing I regret is that it took me this long to stop needing your approval. She said nothing more. Later that night, Lucas joined me in my office. The skyline glittered behind him, 1,000 lights shining against the dark, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. You did well, he said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle my grandfather used to reserve for victories that mattered. Your grandfather would be proud. I looked down at the amber in my glass, thinking about the man who had believed in me when no one else did, and the legacy he had left in my hands, not just a company, but a chance to write my own story. Not just proud, I said softly. He knew I'd fight for this. And I had, not for power, not for money, but for the promise he made me in that hospital room and the future he believed I could build. 1 year after that vote, the day I stood alone in the boardroom and refused to surrender the future my grandfather entrusted to me, I found myself standing beneath the vaulted lights of a packed auditorium in Chicago, facing hundreds of investors, partners, and employees. Behind me, the newly unveiled banner bore the words, Beaumont Holdings, a legacy reimagined. It felt surreal. Not because I had made it to this stage, but because of everything I had survived to earn it. When I approached the podium, the room quieted with a reverence that hadn't existed before, one not granted out of formality or fear, but forged through battles I had fought with my head held high. I looked down at the business magazine sitting on the edge of the lectern. Its cover bore a bold headline that just a year ago would have been unimaginable. Mara Beaumont, the young CEO who outsmarted the empire. I took a breath, not to collect myself, but to ground myself in the gravity of the moment. When my grandfather handed me this company, I began, my voice even, a lot of people whispered that I hadn't earned it, that I was too young, too inexperienced, too soft. There was a pause, Not dramatic, but necessary. But what they didn't understand is that legacy isn't about age. It's not about how many years you've spent sitting at a table. It's about how deeply you respect what that table was built for and who you become when people try to pull the chair out from under you. I glanced toward the audience, where a few familiar faces nodded quietly. Some of them had doubted me. Some had even tried to replace me. And yet, here they were present, attentive, and perhaps finally willing to believe in what I had built. I continued, weaving my journey into the values I now lived by. My grandfather taught me that leadership isn't loud. It's not about demanding power, it's about protecting those who depend on you, even when it costs you everything. He believed in sacrifice, in doing what's right even when no one's watching, and in planning for storms before they come. And he believed in Menno because I was perfect, but because I listened, I learned. And I never ran. The room was silent again, but this time it felt full alive with something unspoken. After the speech, I stepped off stage and into the wings, where Lucas was waiting. He didn't say much, he never did, but he clapped me on the shoulder once, firmly, and said, "You've stopped proving yourself, Mara. Now you're leading." Later that evening, as I sat in my corner office watching the lights of the city stretch like veins across the night, I thought about the version of me who once stood at my grandfather's bedside, uncertain and overwhelmed. I thought about the girl who had been dismissed, outnumbered, underestimated, and I realized she hadn't just survived the fire, she'd rebuilt something stronger in its ashes. Richard and my mother had vanished from public view after the scandal. Whispers said they'd moved to Europe, chasing business ventures that never seemed to stick. I never heard from them again, and I didn't look back. Because the truth is, when people show you who they are in your weakest moment, you learn to stop expecting apologies. Today, Beaumont Holdings is not just surviving, it's evolving. We've launched 3 new initiatives focused on ethical innovation and mentorship for women in executive leadership, and I've made it my personal mission to honor my grandfather's values, not just in policy, but in culture. His legacy gave me a foundation, but what I've built since then, that's mine. And to anyone watching who's been betrayed by the people closest to them, who's been told they're not enough, not strong enough, not worthy, I want you to hear this. You don't have to wait for someone to choose you. You can choose yourself. And when you do, don't let go. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's more where this came from, and you deserve to hear every word of it.